Hello, I'm Jackie Pfeffer-Merrill, Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center program on Campus Free Expression. I'd like to welcome you to the second of our two-part webinar series, Campus Free Expression during COVID-19. Today's webinar is Beyond the Classroom, Student Life During COVID-19. The Bipartisan Policy Center is a Washington, D.C. think tank that promotes security and opportunity for American families by bringing together the best ideas from both parties. And the Bipartisan Policy Center's Campus Free Expression project promotes policies and programs of college campuses that foster a safe and welcoming environment for robust intellectual exchange. Especially during an election year, colleges and universities have a special role in introducing students to a broad range of issues and ideas, teaching them the values of mutual respect and principled disagreement, and helping them to learn about the ways in which principled, respectful conversation can serve our democracy well. I'd like briefly to introduce our four distinguished panelists today. Carol Sumners is the Texas Tech Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Chief Diversity Officer at that Texas Tech school. Elizabeth Maddow is Associate Research Professor and Director of the Center for Youth Political Participation at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. Aaliyah McLean is a brand new alumna of James Madison University and its immediate past president of its Student Government Association. She's returning to campus this fall to be a Martin Democracy Fellow at James Madison University Center for Civic Engagement. And I want to say congratulations on graduating during this most difficult spring. And Vijay Pendekar is the Robert W. and Elizabeth C. Staley Dean of Students at Cornell University. So thank you all for coming. Their full bios and Twitter handles are on our event webpage. And for our audience, I'd like to say a little bit about our show. For the next 40 minutes, we five will have a moderated discussion about strategies for fostering a robust student life during this most difficult upcoming semester. College isn't about just what goes on in the classroom. Instead, college is an opportunity for students to meet students and peers who come from communities very different from their own, to be introduced to new ideas and viewpoints, and to develop the skills of respectful citizenship and to be an independent thinker and lifelong learner. And for our audience, there's going to be lots of opportunities for participation too. You can pose your comments about our conversation or your questions at any time on Twitter using the hashtag BPC Live or posting them in the YouTube or Facebook chat. And so now to our conversation. Carol, I'm going to start with you. So at Texas Tech, you're planning on coming back to a hybrid campus. I just want to ask you to start out, what did you observe about student life when you went remote, and what are your apprehensions and hopes for student life this fall?
Certainly. Well, thank you for having me. It's a joy to be a part of this conversation. We saw, with the immediate kind of change from spring break, students having to leave campus, there were a number of things that we had to hurriedly put together, particularly looking at an online and distance education experience for students who had just weeks before been in classroom environments. And so we didn't have a lot of time, but fortunately for Tech, we have an e-learning team that is particularly dedicated to our online education. So we were able to make many transitions with their help, systems already being in place. But as we're starting to look at the shift in the student environment, there was a lot of transition that was hurried. Our students didn't get to celebrate some of the traditions that they'd experienced. We as a campus were in the midst of resolving some issues that we'd had, particular to free speech and race incident that had happened via social media. So we were in the midst of a lot of things and just had to look at ways that we could address them. Looking forward to the fall, we're still identifying how we're going to have our students come back to campus and feel that sense of community. We are a Red Raider family. We're very excited about that, but we've had more time to prepare. There has certainly been an emphasis on maintaining as best as we're able an in-person experience. So we have something called the Red Raider Commitment, a series of videos that have come out every week. We're also looking at orientation experiences. We've implemented a new training to look at free speech and diversity of opinions through something called Voices of Change. So some steps. We're certainly excited.
Great. Well, I want to hear more about those steps. I'm going to come back to them. But Aaliyah, I'd like to come back to you. So James Madison University is planning to return in person. And I know that last week you did a virtual orientation for incoming students to introduce them to the values of the community. And you had 3 panels with you, a student leader, and a Harrisonburg community member. So I'd just love to hear about those events.
Yeah, definitely. So as you all may know, JMU, our orientation is we take really pride in it. So really our orientation occurs throughout the entire summer. So students normally pre-COVID last year, et cetera, would come to campus for a day and we bring board. And this they have a personalized kind of mentor, which is called an orientation peer advisor. We call them OPAs. And they walk them through the day, help them register for classes, kind of that introduction to JMU. And then they come back in August normally, and we have a week called 1787, where it's a week before classes start, where they're really just involved in getting to know the community, campus, and things like that. And so this year, not being able to do those things and not being able to have Springboard, it was really awesome that JMU really found ways to integrate orientation to online and new ways to meet new students and really connect with them so they still feel that sense of community before they even get to JMU. And so this year we were so excited to partner up with the orientation office and the community service learning office and do a program about community building through civic learning and community engagement. And so really our main goal was to help students identify their passions. What are they interested in? What do they want to do throughout their time at JMU, or what have they done in high school? And how can we help them implement that? And the idea is at the end of the month to register them to vote and for them to understand their civic agency and that civic motivation and knowing that Harrisonburg is a new community for them, but you still belong here and your ideas matter. And so it was a really interesting thing. So we had the mayor on one of our panels, different nonprofit leaders, and just student leaders involved in different things on campus like Black Student Alliance, the Student Government Association, and even a leadership center, really helping students understand that there is not one definition and there is not one sense of passion you have to be a change agent. So our main goal, we just walked through a presentation of saying, what are you interested in? Really identify your passions, know that motivation, where that comes from, that why, the how, and then now what can you do to really make these changes and how can you put that action piece? And so we made like a civic action plan with them and really just gave them foundational pieces so they can really make these changes as their time goes on at JMU.
Thanks. I mean, I'm going to ask more about that too. Vijay, I'd like to come to you. So just asking, Cornell's planning on coming back in person. You know, what did you see in the spring, and what are you anticipating and concerned about going into the fall?
Sure thing. You know, as Carol and Aaliyah have already spoken to, the spring was, we've used the word a lot, unprecedented, but having to empty a campus because of the need to de-densify presented a lot of new challenges and opportunities. And one of the things that we did that I think worked really well in this space, I mean, there was a lot of lessons learned through things not working, but one of the things that really worked was to very quickly stand up an exemptions process. So as we needed to get as many people off the campus and out of the campus as possible. But we also knew that many of our students have vulnerabilities or complex home circumstances that make it so that going home really would have been pretty deleterious, either to their health or their safety. So we created an exceptions process with a committee review where people could apply to say, I know you need to empty the campus, but I have special circumstances and I can't go home. And we staffed that committee with folks from the multicultural and inclusion support areas, plus also some folks from Cornell Health Services, and then also some people from the international services area, because oftentimes some of our international students were saying, we really can't go back. And so we brought some of the specialty offices to bear on the review of the exceptions appeals process, and we're able to actually retain a couple hundred students who really had very difficult life circumstances within our residence halls, even though the goal was to get the campus pretty much emptied. And I think that strikes a balance between the exigency of trying to manage a pandemic, but also the reality that we have to be a community of care and think in a nuanced way around the vulnerabilities that people have. There are so many other things that I know will come up over the course of the conversation, so I'll wait until we get into some more questions.
All right. I do want to ask about looking ahead to the fall. Even though you're bringing people back, you're putting together as a key piece of virtual engagement guide um, with resources for students, organizations, and just for students in general to be engaged with one another outside the classroom. So can you just tell us, I know that was a key piece. What is in the guide, and maybe just share one or two resources that are available?
Sure thing. And the great thing about the guide being digital is that anybody who's watching this webinar can easily access it. So we actually built a guide called Virtual Co-Curricular Programming Resources in the spring, because as we were emptying the campus, we were thinking about the reality that we still needed to find ways to engage our students. And the only way we were going to be able to do that is through a variety of virtual platforms. So we quickly put together two different kinds of guides. One we call the Faculty and Staff Programming Toolbox. And there's three kind of bodies of information within the Faculty and Staff Programming Toolbox. And this is meant to help faculty and staff put on successful co-curricular virtual programs for their students, right? So it's not about engaging faculty and staff, but rather empowering faculty and staff to do right by their students in the virtual space. And so we've got guides on how to do virtual programming well, so the actual techniques of doing virtual programming. There's a second set of guides that are actually ideas of the kinds of programs that might be more successful, so that faculty and staff who want to engage their students don't have to start from scratch. And then the third is an exhaustive list of external resources of places you can go on the web to get a lot of information about how to do virtual programming for college students successfully. And we created a parallel set of tabs that are actually the student-to-student guide. So actually creating information that's more student-friendly to say, if you're a student leader on campus and you want to program for your peers, here's some tips and tricks that can actually make you more successful. We, over the summer, we've been building those out and expanding them, and actually also modifying them based on what we learned. Because as we went through the spring, we learned a lot about virtual programming. And so by the time the students are back in the fall, those websites should look pretty different.
Great. I think we all learned a lot about being online this spring and summer, a skill set that maybe none of us, some of us thought we never really have. Elizabeth, I want to come to you about a special set of programs that you're planning at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. You're looking for a special week early in the term, starting with Constitution Day on September 17th and through September 22nd, National Voter Registration Week. And tell us about that activity and what you've got planned.
Well, and I would say, much of what we're planning is what we learned this summer, based on what we learned this summer, and built a few models throughout the summer on what works and what doesn't. So pretty quickly, once, we did need to move remotely, we recognized there were still some unique challenges, needs that our students had. One of them being, we still had a primary to come up in New Jersey. We had originally had a primary scheduled for June. It got pushed back to July, and it was going to be almost entirely vote by mail. So helping students understand the changes to the process and the realities of actually completing an application and completing a ballot, a vote by mail ballot, was new to a lot of New Jersey residents, but certainly new to a lot of Rutgers students. So we were able to really test out some tools over the summer with strong student involvement and put together a campaign, multimedia campaign called Primed for the Primaries, in which we had students do such things as hold live Facebook Q&A interviews with election officials. We had students do a video that on how to fill out your ballot that we put on TikTok. We got a TikTok account this summer. So much of what we learned this summer we'll be applying this fall. But certainly, as you said, Jackie, that week between Constitution Day and National Voter Registration Day, we'll be doing a multifaceted effort that will include things such as, traditional book talks, perhaps, traditional in that not so traditional, will be on Zoom, but doing book talks, but also really trying to feature our students as much as possible. So what we're hoping to do for Constitution Day in particular, normally if we were on campus, we'd invite a high profile speaker and do a lecture that'd be open to the campus. Instead, we're going to be focusing on our students and inviting students from all of Rutgers campuses, Newark and Camden and New Brunswick, to reflect on what American democracy means to them and how they fit in American democracy, and express that in whatever medium they choose, whether it's a poem, whether it's an essay, but really showcasing them on our website, but then featuring them on our social media platforms.
Aaliyah, I want to thanks very much for that, Elizabeth. I want to come back to you for one of the ways that students have been active. I know at this Civic Engagement Center, you have planned in the past tent talks as ways of getting students sharing their views. And tell us what a tent talk is and how they're being reconfigured for a time of pandemic.
Yeah, definitely. So our tent talks are definitely, I feel like, our most popular really reach students. And I think it's really because of the idea, especially in higher education, it's so known to do programs typically after classes around 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock, sometimes in the evening. But I think you're forgetting to factor in sometimes obligations that some students have to do. Some have to work, some may have other obligations at home, they may be commuting. It's just not possible for them to get back to campus. And so with tent talks, it's really, we found a way to meet students at times that are most convenient to them. And so really we'll set up on our kind of most popular location on campus called the Quad or the Commons. And really while students are just walking to classes, maybe going to their cars, you can just see our tent, you'll stop by. So we'll have a big tent out there, and basically we will have a table, and we'll also have a dry erase board. And the dry erase board will kind of prompt a question. And really I say what these questions are just those things that people tell you about. So, those conversations on a Thanksgiving dinner that, you're told avoid these things. We can't talk about these things. And our main hope is to talk about these things. We want to make these political conversations something that you actually do consider. We want to challenge your thoughts, and we also want to you. And so you can learn from other students. And so a way that we kind of get students to come over is we'll have some pizza from a local place that is really popular in campus called Benny's Pizza. So we'll have Benny's there, and we're like, oh, come get some free lunch. Come over here. And then we'll say, hey, here, why don't you read this question and write your answer to it? And so one question that we really focus on that we always love to talk about is, have you thought about your citizenship status today? And that question sounds so simple, but it truly is a real thing. Have you thought about that today? Have you thought about what that encompasses and what that means and what that looks like? And our director talks about this one story that he just really admires is a student walked by and said, I haven't thought about that, not until this moment. And that piece of not until this moment for us just sticks out. And that is the work that we want to do. We want to really cultivate these ideas and these questions that you may not be thinking about because society has told you to avoid them. And it has told you, oh, we can't talk about that here. But you can talk about that here, and we can critically learn from each other, and we can dive into that. And so then it just brings the opportunity to bring that dialogue together. And so getting that pizza, learning from each other, other students just merging together. And so really, we're still hoping to do that in the fall since we are coming back to campus, but in a very social distance way. We're trying to think of ways online that we can do pop-up Wednesday conversation one that we've been doing this summer. But really, our hope is to still be there because we'll offer voter registration, absentee ballots, and things like that. So in a very social distance way, but we still want to reach those students.
So it sounds like it will really be physically distanced, but not really socially together.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Carol, I want to come back to something that you said in the introduction. You mentioned the Voices of Change program that you have at Texas Tech that really helps get students past the kind of cancel culture by committing to listening to people respectfully and being able to say, I hear you, but I disagree, but I do hear you. So can you tell us a little bit about what that program is?
Sure. Well, it was something that we'd started looking at as we're moving to an online orientation experience. We knew in the fall that there was an opportunity to explore identity and to talk about diversity through the onboarding of new students, because that's really a critical part of creating a culture. We want the Red Raider experience to mean something significant to the students. And so our student affairs team started looking at orientation experiences and then looking at this video that we could provide to all new students. And so it starts out talking about identity and how we are, as individual people, multifaceted. We are multi-identitied individuals, and that in that there are these intersections that happen with us and other people. And as much as we recognize bias, there is a projection that we have of people being a certain kind of way, and we're trying to address that those stereotypes or biases are something we all have, but we have to work to avoid them. Because when you start recognizing or acknowledging, not avoiding them like we don't see them, but acknowledging they exist, and then leveraging our awareness of that in the conversations that we have, that we don't have to agree, and still we can differ. Because as our students are moving into these spaces, and as Aaliyah shared, we want students to recognize we can talk about race, we can talk about politics, we can talk about citizenship, we can talk about how some celebrate some holidays and others see those not as holidays, but the reasons behind them, and that there's a transparency in the way that we're sharing this space as a community coming together and being able to dialogue. I had so it wasn't surreal, but it was a very telling experience. I went into a classroom with some of our new students, and I asked them, tell me your thoughts about me. I want you to tell me what you assume about me. And there were lots of different things. I shop at Target. I had 2 kids. I have a business degree. There must have been 20 or 30 different assumptions that the students made about me. One student said he didn't think that I could be in a sorority, so we had to explore. Why would that be? He said, because you're not white or a white female. So we talked about that. And I'm actually the second of a third generation in the same sorority. My mother is college educated and pledged the sorority in 1964. But again, his stereotype of me was based on what he thought represented Greek life. And yet in all of the 30, not one student, and I said there's something glaring, not one student said that I was Black or that I was a woman. And when we talked about that, I asked them why not? And they said, because we don't talk about those things. And we shouldn't acknowledge them because it's not polite. And so we had a conversation about, I don't want you to avoid that because the world sees me through my external presentation. And yet I want people to not make assumptions about any of us based on one thing. So back to the voices of change, it is starting our students at a conversation that says, you're going to come into this community where you're going to meet the world. Let's look at how we value what we each bring. And then let's look at how collectively we're contributing to the campus experience by adding to it. That means white students, brown students, Black students, Hispanic students, international students, but we really look across at rural students. We don't want to make assumptions. So that's a part of creating that culture through the onboarding process of our new students.
Yeah, I do want to come back to those, questions of talking about race and, looking into the fall, talking about the George Floyd murder. But before I do that, I want to talk about another strategy for learning to talk about these difficult conversations. And this Voices of Change, part of the freshman orientation. Elizabeth, I want to ask you about a 1-credit course that Rutgers offers for freshmen. Talking politics, disagreeing without being disagreeable in it. Tell us just briefly about the course and how it's being reconfigured for this fall.
Sure. So yes, with a colleague, we piloted this course, a 1-credit course for incoming freshmen called Talking Politics, Disagreeing Without Being Disagreeable. And similar to Carol's point, or just to piggyback on what Carol was indicating, There are many facets of political and civic engagement. And certainly as a political scientist, I realize or recognize that many of these skills need to be taught, not just things like how to consume news, how to find your polling location, but how to engage in political discussions. And so we created a one-credit seminar course for incoming freshmen that really explored that. Looked at, first of all, sort of the democratic roots of political discourse, really arguing that if we're going to be a nation that respects and preserves liberty, which we are, that it's going to be natural that we're going to have a diversity of viewpoints, and that the system is really set up in such a way to allow the exchange of these viewpoints, and more importantly, to foster compromise. But again, as Carol referenced, students are uncertain about how to engage in political discussions, are uncertain how to approach it respectfully, productively, but I'm also finding, especially Gen Z in particular, want to talk about politics. And certainly this summer and heading into the fall, students want to talk politics, but need guidance. So we use this course as a way to learn the skills, practice the skills of political discourse, whether it's perspective taking, active listening, fact checking, checking yourself and checking others. And watching political practitioners do it well and do it poorly. So we're certainly hoping to take that into the fall. We will be remote, but trying to take it to an even broader audience. Most likely through we have a Pizza and Politics series, sounds like something similar at James Madison, but an opportunity to bring students together, preferably with pizza, so students may need to bring their own pizza, but to talk about difficult, challenging topics, but doing it in a productive way. And one last thing I'll mention, so I can not hog the airspace, which is one thing we don't want to be doing, is hogging the airspace, is we often begin with an exercise that I highly recommend, developed by the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education, where we begin our semester by crafting a set of norms or practices for political discussion, developed by someone, Nancy Thomas, who's a recognized national scholar on this topic, but really beginning as a pedagogical exercise. What are some norms and practices of productive, respectful, but honest and candid discussion? And it's a way to explore what they are, but also to hold ourselves accountable throughout a semester. So I'm happy to talk more about that throughout the discussion, and provide the URL too, because it's a fantastic resource that we use extensively.
Yeah, and in fact, Nancy Thomas is on our Constitution Day event here at BPC, and she'll be talking about student practices and best practices for engaging students in politics in our Constitution Day webinar here.
Great.
I want to talk a little bit more about these questions of Generation Z students, and they're of course, not all college students are in that traditional 18 to 22-year-old. What we used to think of as the typical college student isn't so much the typical college student anymore. But there has been a generational change. The Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, in its new, just released report on the American Freshman 2019, looking at last year's freshmen, noted that habits of mind, such as asking questions in class, has gone down. Jean Twenge and her colleagues at San Diego State University have looked at online use by Generation Z students and find they spend an hour less per person in in-person interactions than those a generation ago. So they're just less practiced at having certain kinds of conversations, both agreeable ones and disagreeable ones. And I'm just thinking, what are the other kinds of strategies that we can use for matriculating students and students who are coming onto campus as freshmen in a most unusual time to really set them up for success in this unusual year? And Aaliyah, I understand you're going to be in a first year dorm as a residence advisor, so I'm going to come back to others too, but I'm going to start with you. What are you doing for these first year students this year?
Yes, I'm so excited about this as well. So JMU has a program called Faculty in Residence, and it's where faculty can live in a residence hall. And so I'm here now. You wouldn't even tell I'm in a residence hall, and you basically you get an apartment, but you serve as just someone that students can go to for just different types of guidance. Typically in their Scott, what they're doing and what they're learning about. And so for me, it's interesting because I am a faculty member, but most of the FIRs are in academia, so they're professors in a certain department. But for me, I'm in civic engagement, and so one of my main goals this year with my role as a Woodson Martin Democracy Fellow is let's talk about different refugee communities, and let's talk about just immigration policies and just the United States and Virginia and Harrisonburg particularly is one of the largest refugee resettlement populations here. So let's talk about that. And so I just believe in order to really help students feel invested, to help them feel like they can trust you and feel safe, is to create that level of vulnerability. And so I love Dr. Brene Brown, if any of you all have looked at her work, but really the foundation is vulnerability. And so my key in the programs that I'll be doing this semester is really creating that foundation so they feel safe, they feel heard, they know that their experience is valid, even if it's different from someone next to them. Because regardless, we all have different experiences in our life and different backgrounds that make a different complex view and perception. And so my goal is to do different round circles about this, helping them learn their passions, what they're really engaged about, experiences in their life have they had, and how can they use that for their purpose, and how can they serve others with that. And then also then connecting it to an alternative break, which is a service learning trip where you go to another community and you learn a different social issue. And so one of my main goals this year is to do an alternative break on immigration. And so going somewhere and learning about this and taking a group of students with us and doing this with them. And so you're able to really see that reflection, that critical thinking in that community. And so that is really the main goal. I just feel like help students feel safe and that they can trust you and they can talk about you. And when they do open up about their beliefs and opinions, they're not wrong. That they understand that you're challenging them and you're growing with them, but they feel that safety. And so I'm really excited because I feel like first years, they graduated during our pandemic, which I can relate to. I can truly relate to what it feels like to just up and just next week, you're online, and you're done. And your graduation is like, where's the graduation? And so honestly, I think with that creates that they can relate and they can, I feel like have that different type of relationship with me because I have similar experiences them and I understand what that's like. And I think sometimes we're in a community and we're in society that always just tells you move on and get over it. But this is a traumatic experience that we have to validate. And that's going to shape their experiences and their decisions and for them to feel like that. And so I'm really excited about all of those things just all in one. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge in these conversations that there's so many levels and there's so many layers that we have to consider as we start diving in and talking about different political discussions and things like that.
Right.
Hey, Jay, I want to ask you about what you're thinking about for, especially for freshmen coming in and helping them be introduced to collegiate life in this most unusual time.
Sure. I'll mention a couple of things because I actually was very interested in some of the points Carol and Elizabeth were making about how we prepare people to have conversations across difference and conversations about politics. I'm familiar with Gene Twinge's work out of San Diego State University and some of the alarming trend lines on Gen Z in terms of being overly formed in the digital space and being very uncomfortable with in-person engagement. And I think a significant growth area for higher education, to be diplomatic about it, or to say an area that we're not really doing good work in right now, is actually operationalizing the skill sets of talking about diversity. I think we've overemphasized the what of diversity and underemphasized the how of diversity. So when I'm a college student, I can take course after course after course on various racial histories, on urban sociology, on anthropology of religion. All of that is wonderful, right? Because it builds up the complexity of my thinking and my vocabulary, my sense of what the literature is. But then you put these really educated students in a room to have a conversation about something that invokes some passions, and we all have seen it happen before, and it falls apart pretty quickly. And that's because I think we've underemphasized the secondary component here, which is actually the skill set of being able to craft arguments while keeping our cool, to be able to listen to someone who's saying something that makes us upset and not lose our ability to hear them. And that actually can be taught. And so one of the ways that Cornell is trying to get involved in this skills-based diversity education movement is to really heavily invest in the Intergroup dialogue project. And the Intergroup dialogue model is a model of actually having dialogue across difference that was created at the University of Michigan. It's one of the only empirically researched and validated diversity education platforms that seems to prove change over time. And so we've really put a lot of resources in our IDP model. And for incoming freshmen, every first-year student, we started this a couple of years ago, every first-year student gets a 3-hour dialogue training workshop as part of orientation. And that's not a silver bullet. We all know that learning is recursive and iterative. And so, that's a first introduction, and there has to be a lot after that to scaffold it towards real change. But part of what we do during orientation is actually to say dialogue skills are this important to our community that we're going to take 3 hours out of your orientation and have every single freshman go through this. In terms of pivoting into this fall with the pandemic, there's a lot of loss, and I really want to respect what Aaliyah said about trauma, right? We got to recognize that there's a grieving process to go through to let go of the norms. I do want to highlight that there are actually some things that are happening that are interesting and possible in this space that weren't possible before. So as we've moved orientation into fully virtual formats, we're actually building out a parent and family orientation sequence that was never possible before at Cornell because we just didn't have the operational and logistical bandwidth. Right. But now that everybody's in their own homes watching these things online, we can actually create a set of engagement opportunities, training videos, webinars that are parent and family facing. And we've desperately needed that for a long time because families, all the student success data shows that when families are prepared to be part of the success package, then the students do better. And so, there's an equity question. If we're not engaging families, how do we expect first generation and low income college students to be able to compete with their more privileged peers? So I think there's some exciting innovations possible as well in this pivot to the fully virtual orientation and onboarding sequence.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds terrific. And the University of Michigan materials are wonderful resources. I want to ask a question, and maybe I'll set this up with some data, and Carol, maybe I'll start with you. So it's great to have these conversations where people get skills about talking across difference, but we do know that there are sometimes students and people off campus too will say that viewpoint is just too offensive, or I disagree too strongly to engage with that. And UNC researchers earlier this year and before the pandemic released a survey of UNC students, and kudos to them for doing this research at UNC, that found that a broad majority of both liberal and conservative and moderate students said that they wanted more opportunities to hear from those with whom they disagreed and who had different ideas. But there was a significant minority that really held a different view. A quarter of students said that they would interrupt or try to block a student or a speaker with whom they strongly disagreed. 14% of conservative students said the campus would be better without liberal students, and 22% of liberals said this campus would be better without conservative students. So it's really a deep unwillingness to engage certain points of views among this minority, but sizable minority of students. And I think for if one's out in a broader community, there isn't really an obligation to listen to those with whom you disagree. But a college and a liberal arts education is really about learning to have conversations and engage viewpoints and ideas that you hadn't thought of or didn't agree with. And I'm wondering, what are the ways in which we can equip our students when they're on a quad or in a dorm? Because when they're in a classroom, a faculty member is there to be the devil's advocate or to bolster a student who's in a minority position in the classroom. But outside of the classroom, how is it that, and what strategies can we give to students to really help them commit to listening to others with whom they have principal disagreement, and have strategies when they encounter that kind of deep resistance to listening to another viewpoint? So, Carol, that's a tough one. I'm going to start with you.
Well, I was at another institution. There's no secret, you'll see it in my bio. I was at Arizona State University for 14 years. There's sunshine almost every day and free speech visitors many of those days, that would be there for 8 hours a day. And they would take a pretty entrenched position on some of the things that they would say on campus. And so our responsibility as an institution was to help students navigate that. But, one of the things, Jackie, that I would say is that we don't create pockets. Like, here you get to practice and understand what it is to disagree civilly, and then here it's a very different experience. We're trying to teach them the skills, the language, the experience of participating in conversations where you're not always going to be the person with everyone agreeing to. And so how do we teach them that individuals will have different perspectives? I think there's also a part of this that we're trying to teach students, which is learn histories. Sometimes things are said out of ignorance. Other times things are said as perpetuated thoughts and ideologies because they haven't known differently. And so I will often have these exercises that I'll do with individuals that are a low threat. And so I ask questions. How do you eat your cereal? And it seems like, what kind of question is that? But I did this exercise with 3 students, and I asked them, how did they do it? One student says, well, I eat it. I pour my cereal in the bowl first, and then I pour my milk on top. Another student said, same room, 3 students, all 3 females. The next student says, well, I don't like milk. I eat my cereal dry. And the third was like the mind blower. She says, I actually pour my milk in the bowl first and then eat the cereal. I pour some in, I eat the cereal out of the bowl until it's gone and then pour it back in. So I'm thinking, who does that, right? That's not something I'd heard of. But for her, it was because she didn't like soggy cereal. And so as a child, she found a way to do it. I share this because people approach things differently. If we don't ever ask, how did you come to that? We don't have the opportunity to learn or to explore. And I had a conversation with someone else where we vastly differed on our political ideologies. But at the end of the conversation, what we both agreed on is, I don't want you making assumptions about me based on something that you know. And we share more things in common than we share differences. But in the midst, we all want to be valued as individuals. So how do we maintain that? But I don't partition off. And that's what we're trying to teach students, is that what happens in the classroom is not separate from what happens when you walk through the quad or when you get into these other dialogues or conversations or when you get on Facebook, because free speech is not consequence-free speech. And so we want people to understand that there will be those that will push back. So how do you then have that conversation in a meaningful way?
I want to, it looks like Vijay, you were trying to jump in there too. And I'll ask you in a minute about the same question, but how do you get people to really commit to listening? But I want to invite our audience to submit questions. I see some questions are already queuing up for us. If you can submit your questions with the hashtag BPC Live or on YouTube or Facebook in the chat function. Vijay, how about, I know Cornell has a wonderful statement that you issued last year, the Cornell core values, and the second one is about open inquiry, exchange, and free expression. When students really don't want to hear or say something is too disagreeable, too offensive, how do you get students to commit to that core value of open inquiry?
Sure, I'm going to try and go for a twofer here because I see Carolyn Cooper has submitted a question that says, what will the hardest facet of student life to adopt amid the pandemic be, right? So I'm going to try and land at the nexus of Jackie's question and Carolyn's question here, because I think these are pretty intertwined. The times that I've seen, and the polarization that we're talking about, right? Campuses are reflective of our society. So I also think when the media takes American higher education to task for something that is actually symptomatic of a broader social problem, it's pretty dishonest, right? The level of polarization we're seeing on our campuses is reflective of the same polarizations we see in our society. But nonetheless, the opportunity campuses have that oftentimes broader societies don't have are to actually structure what I see as one of the possible not solutions, but it can help make this less worse, is to structure complex intergroup interaction
Yes.
that is not about these topics, but about other
Right.
things. So, for example, there are some very polarized groups at Cornell where the heads of these groups you would think would hate each other because, in terms of how they spar in the campus newspaper or when they show up at the student government and spar in front of the student government, they're just at each other's throats. But the presidents and vice presidents of these groups sometimes are like best friends, and I see them hanging out on the quad, like picnicking and stuff, and I'm like, what's going on here? So I always ask. I walk up and I'm like, so why are you two so chummy, or are you three so chummy? When I see you constantly duking it out in the newspaper, and they're like, oh, well, we took this alternative spring break trip together, and we were doing service work here and learning about some stuff.
Right.
And then every night we were just posted up in the youth hostel talking until like 3 a.m. And yeah, I can't stand their views on this thing, but we're like ride or die homies now. And so it's like, okay,
Right.
there's the secret sauce of American liberal education, and I mean liberal, not political, but as you know, in terms of the model stemming from the Enlightenment.
Right.
The secret sauce
Right.
is the complex intergroup experience that comes
Yes.
from living together. And so,
Right.
one of the things that I'm most worried about, as somebody who's lived my life in the co-curricular and the outside of classroom experiences, in the move to the fully virtual, the hardest part of student life to adapt is the catalytic experiences that happen when you are forced to physically be in the room and do things with people that are not like you. And virtual environments offer way too much of a chance for you to curate your own echo chamber, and that's part of the problem.
Right.
And what's the Gen Z research shows that if you grow up in a digital space, you likely are growing up in an echo chamber because you can do that in the digital space. And so I'm very worried about. I would love for this pandemic to be over soon so that we can get back to the complexity of in-person contact that I actually think dissolves some of the entrenchment that is haunting our society so badly right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you. We are going to turn to questions and almost immediately. But before we do that, Elizabeth, I want to. We really want to offer our audience takeaways that they can take advantage of this fall. And I know that your institute is going to be launching a microsite for
Yes.
schools that are a little bit overwhelmed trying to help their students get ready both to
Right.
register to vote and to be knowledgeable about the vote. So can you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about your microsite that you're launching next month?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. So certainly one of the great concerns I have right now, and I'm not alone, is what the pandemic will do, the effects of the pandemic on the youth vote. And as we know, young adults, 18 to 29-year-olds, make up a significant portion of the electorate. And in the last few years in particular, we've seen student vote or young adults voting in higher numbers. 2018, we saw some really significant increases. Much of that has to do not just with the attitudinal, the outlook of Gen Z, but a lot of it has to do with what college campuses have been doing. In recent years, college campuses have really honed models of getting students engaged, registered, and voting. Much of that, though, has been thanks to in-person contact, doing voter registration drives and get out the vote drives. So we're not going to have that this fall for many campuses. And as you suggested, Jackie, expectations, norms, practices of voting for young adults in particular are going to be upended. So what we've done is really take the model we've honed on the Rutgers campus through our Are You Voting program and taking it national. Are You Voting is an initiative of Rutgers University that we administer at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. And it's really meant to be a one-stop shop, a reference, a resource that's nonpartisan but accurate, that really walks students through how to get registered, how to get information on candidates, and how to get to the polls, how to vote. So, and much of that we've done through our website. So we are taking that model and creating a microsite that will be available this September and available to college students, colleges across the country that really will offer students state-specific information, the most pertinent, current information they're going to need about their voter registration practices in their state, vote by mail practices in their state, but also some national resources. And I think it's so important, not only for students to find it, but for colleges to know there is a resource that will be available to or applicable to all of their students, no matter what state they're from. And as has been referenced earlier too, I think the more campuses can embed civic engagement into the culture of their campus, the more successful they'll be at getting students politically engaged, civically engaged. But as I said, that's going to be a real challenge this fall, not just because colleges are so overwhelmed right now and facing significant budget setbacks, but there's so much uncertainty and there's so much inaccurate information out there. I think one of the things that's so alarming to me is how politicized vote by mail has become this fall. And it just makes a practice that's already confusing, particularly to college students, even more confusing. So we want to offer that nonpartisan, accurate, reliable information for students and colleges, really supporting colleges. So it's going to be called Are You Voting National, a microsite, and will be available to campuses this September.
I know people have got their pens and pencils out and they're writing that down to be able to follow
Good.
up. Now to turn to questions and answer. Our first question is from Nick Dresler. What strategies do you recommend to get student collaboration with and buy-in to election-related programming? Even our student government has been resistant to getting involved to date. Aaliyah, maybe we'll start with you on getting students involved.
Yes, and it's interesting that it's been hard to even student government, I think, mobilize to do that work. So I actually was the student body president this past year. So I'm the current outgoing student body president. And I think for just helping to engage students is how do you find a way to connect it to what they are actually interested in? I think a lot of times students will say, election programming, I'm not into that. That's not what our mission is. But I think how do you connect your mission to the elections? How do you connect your mission to this greater public good? And so even with the Student Government Association, when I was president, we had a legislative affairs chair, and his primary duty last year was just keeping us up to date with different student policies that we thought would be really important for us to understand, to mobilize, but also different elections. Something that the Center for Civic Engagement does is we do traveling town halls. And so this is where we invite candidates who are running in either local elections or just candidates that we know that are running that we can get to come to Harrisonburg, and we bring them into the residence halls. And so in that lobby, we'll connect with them. And I think that's a great way to connect with different student organizations, because how can you connect their mission with a certain candidate? How can you just get them to feel like this is important to me? And so something that we do is we train different student orgs to do voter registration. And this gives them the agency to do it on their terms, at their programs, at their meetings. But then we just kind of equip them with the skills, and then they kind of have that civic agency to do it and to kind of feel free with that. And so I really think that's the main thing, is connect that to them. And then from there, I think they'll mobilize themselves because they're so interested, and it connects with their passion.
Yeah.
Anyone else in this getting students involved? Carol.
I would totally say that is one of the things, and recognizing that the lack of interest or apathy or fear or concern is multifaceted, because it's about your opinion, your perspective matters. And so what we're trying to get students to understand, I see this again on a continuum. When we ask students to share with us what's your experience at the university, give us feedback. Right? It's also when you tell people what you need, you can hold them accountable to meeting it. But if you do not express, you cannot hold people accountable. So elections to politics, to looking at the student experience, to talking about the things that matter to you, those are relative to you seeing value in your voice. And so while they may say, well, my voice matters here, we can say to students, which is why we, in my practice, we've created space for a student group that is really in coalition. They don't have to be affiliated with anything, but they call themselves Student Intersectional Leadership Council. And they come together to talk about issues of diversity, of equity, of how are we talking about these. They then work with student government. But you're trying to let students know there are many ways to have your voice matter, but you've got to know that for all of these things, because otherwise they just kind of say, nobody cares. My voice is a single voice, because they've heard that far too long. And we have to change that perspective. And then getting them to see students like Aaliyah, who've gone on to do great things. Again, it's being able to see, when I voice, here's what is the potential.
I want to
And
bring
I
in
would
others
agree with
here. So, I know, Elizabeth, you'd like to come in, and then Vijay,
Yeah.
we'll give the chance here.
Well, I
Elizabeth.
think it's so interesting, because there's already some good research, pre-pandemic and before we were all remote, about the importance of peer-to-peer contact. So we know that voter registration and mobilization, for example, is always going to be more successful when peers are reaching out to peers. And certainly that's the case with college-age students. And I think that's been, again, sort of necessity is the mother of invention. There's been a lot of opportunities for us that we've honed over the summer and we'll be using into the fall for our Rutgers students to be reaching out to other Rutgers students or playing a more visible role in the work that we're doing. So, for example, and it may be a way to involve more student groups. So, for example, doing Q&As with election officials, having our students do those Q&As with election officials, not me, or videos that have been created by students. The fact that we're all virtual, using tools that networks that they're already tapped into to distribute our messaging, to disseminate our messaging. We've created something called an Are You Voting Ambassadors program for the students who would normally have been volunteering and doing voter registration drives on campus and can't, to really be creating digital content for Are You Voting, and creating it and sharing it on our social media platforms, and just sort of amplifying our voter information messaging. And I think so. Aaliyah's brought up some really good ideas, but I think the more students can be doing this work and being visible, that's going to make the greatest impact.
Vijay, I want to bring in you here too.
Yeah, I just wanted to, raise a few thoughts and stir the pot a bit here because I've been hearing about youth apathy in the voting space since I was a teenager. And over the last several years, I think the conversation about sort of where the energy is around young people and voting has to be contrasted against the backdrop of one of the most exciting social movements of our time, both in 2014 and 2015, and now Black Lives Matter and the ancillary movements surrounding BLM that are led by young people. And so I also think that it's difficult to talk about apathy when if you're looking out your window, we've got young people in the streets deeply engaged in one of the finest forms of democracy, which is to kind of agitate and try and stop the machine so that you can get concessions that oppressive structures have been unwilling to yield for centuries. And so I think that I'm troubled by conversations around youth apathy in the political process because there are multiple forms of political process. And the one that we are focusing on in today's conversation happens to be one that has historically and presently silenced and excluded people to the point where they might just be done with it. So I don't want to take such a narrow liberal viewpoint on voting that we actually forget the sort of far left viewpoint here, which is this machine has so successfully excluded so many groups that they just might be done. Their community wisdom might be like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'd rather occupy City Hall because nobody's listening to me, and I have cast my vote, and I've cast my vote, and I've cast my vote. So if you can hear some passion in my voice, I do think it's because I think that there is a very centrist trope happening in our dialogue right now that I find very problematic, and it doesn't actually mesh up against the history or the present of what's going on in our country right now.
Well, and what I would add, though, is that, but as we talk about, the word apathy has been used, but it's been disempowerment, right? Because I think it's a projection that says that students don't care. But the reality is, I have been disempowered to the point that I feel these frustrations, and then it just becomes an explosion. What we're trying to do is to promote dialogue, is to see incremental steps and movement, but that means action. And so simultaneous to us saying to the students that they need to raise their voices and continue raising their voices through applying their vote, it's also recognizing the structures that have to change. So when we say to students, we value your vote, then you better be letting them do something with that. And simultaneously, we have to change. We can't keep saying, yes, you matter, sit over there and wait your turn. That's not working. So, as you talk about passion, I'm passionate about language because apathy, I think, has just been disempowerment. And they're like, you know what, we're done. We're done. But done is not finished. Done is like, I'm done talking. I'm gonna take it to the next level. I want you to talk to me so that you can see the impact of your voice. We have not been there.
And certainly
No,
that is the case. Yeah, and I am also in that, certainly in my teaching and in our practice, really identifying for students what are the structures that are in place when it comes to voter registration and election day practices, and they're not done by accident. Helping students understand the role of state legislatures in creating things like identification, rules regarding identification. These aren't by accident. They're created for a purpose. And again, helping students identify what these are and how to undo them. So I would agree also.
If I could say this one thing, it's teaching.
Last comment.
I mean, it's used as a mechanism to keep people out of conversation, because if you act out of order, you can't ever interject in the conversation, because you call me out of order right now. But anyway, you got to teach the rules. You have to open the doors and let students see, because otherwise it remains clouded and invisible, which is not accessible.
Yeah. Well, alas, we are at the end of our hour. I know we could keep going for quite a bit longer, and I just. But gosh, I just really want to say thank you so much, Elizabeth, Vijay, Carol, and Aaliyah. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and knowledge today. Thanks very much to our audience for taking time and the questions and comments that you shared. Please do subscribe to our BPC YouTube channel. We want to say from all of us at BPC, for all of you who are in colleges and university campuses, we know you're coming back to what will be a very challenging and difficult semester. We send you our very best wishes. And to learn more about our work at BPC on campus free expression, I encourage you to visit our website, bipartisanpolicy.org, where you can subscribe to our monthly e-newsletter and watch the first in this two-part webinar series. The first one was called Pandemic Pedagogy, Classroom in Remote Instruction and Open Exchange. So thanks very much to all. Do have a good weekend. Bye-bye now.
Bye. Congratulations, Aaliyah.
Thank you.